Hello friends, once again welcome back to my channel and video presentations. In this part we will be discussing pedigree analysis. We know pedigree is a tree-like diagram which represent the pattern of inheritance of a particular trait within a family. Usually this trait will be associated with a genetic disorder like sickle cell anemia or any other genetic disorder. And the advantage of tracking a particular genetic disorder or a particular trait is that if you can track back the pattern of expression of a trait in the previous generation of a family, you can predict the possible expression pattern in the future generations also. So if it is possible, you can avoid the possibilities of gene expression, just like you can avoid a pregnancy for a particular period of time, or you can take more precautionary measures, or you can have a medical attention in that particular individual, right? So in many ways the individual is going to be benefited with this kind of analysis, because nowadays there is a new area of genetics has been evolved called uh, genetic counseling. In fact, it's not a new area, but in many countries it's now being institutionalized, right? So this genetic counseling will give you an idea about your inheritance pattern, and these genetic counselors will solely, they'll primarily depend on this pedigree or this family tree in order to find out the gene expression patterns. And interestingly, by genetic counseling, it's like they'll cross match whether yours and your partner's genetic status are compatible or not. In that way the world is changing with the informations available from genetic studies, especially studies like pedigree analysis. All right. So in this part, we'll be looking into the very basic concepts of pedigree. What is pedigree and why it is being utilized? How it is used for the analysis of the inheritance pattern. Okay. So let's move to the presentation. So, what is pedigree? That's the first question to be addressed. Pedigree is a family tree or a chart to represent the inheritance of characters. In simple definition, it is a family tree to represent the inheritance of characters. Right. Usually, we'll be focusing on a single trait. Right. And it's used to analyze the pattern of inheritance of a particular trait throughout a family, so that you will get a family history of in relation with that particular trait, right? And as already stated, usually this phenotype will be associated with a disease which is under study. Okay. And while you are drawing, since it's a kind of diagram, while drawing the diagram you need to use certain symbols and notations, and for that we have certain standard symbols and notations to represent the family members and also their relationships. All right. Then a pedigree will be helping us in two ways. Basically, why we use pedigree? Because it will give us an idea about the previous generation. That means it will help us to determine how a specific gene was inherited in the past. What is the nature of inheritance in what generations these particular gene was expressed, and in which generation this was not expressing. Right. That is one idea. The second thing, definitely, this will will be giving an idea of future generations expression of that gene. That means this is a kind of prediction. So based on the available data of previous generation, you can go for a prediction in future generations. Okay. Then of course definitely there will be a question like why we are using an analysis like pedigree analysis, because it's very much heard in human genetics, not in other usually in plants or in other smaller level organisms like in bacteria. So why there is no pedigree like analysis in other organisms? The answer is because when we learned about the Mendelian genetics, we never heard about a pedigree in that discussions. It's because during the Mendel or for the Mendelian studies, it was possible to study the characters through the genetic crossing, okay, or through the studies of artificial crossing and all other various experiments which Mendel was performing, right? So in humans, all those things are not possible usually. Like the things which are not possible, or why we use pedigree in humans, because in humans it's unable to control genetic process, right? And normally we know that in human beings we cannot simply go for an experimental cross. Usually people go for sexual reproduction for their having their desire to have a children, or of a child, usually in that way. But they never go for sexual reproduction just for an experiment. It's unlikely in case of human being. The second thing is that there is a long generation time. The generation time is pretty long. You can see that for human beings, the sexual reproduction, an individual becomes capable of sexual reproduction only after his puberty. That means he can consider 15 or 16 as the age for sexual reproduction. So, and once he is ready for sexual reproduction and he develops a progeny at the age of 17 or 18, then that progeny needs another 16 or 18 years for producing the next progeny. Which means if you want to observe for a character, just like Mendel observed in his pea plant, he was observing the first generation, second generation and third generation. That was done within few months. But in case of human being, if you want to observe 3 generations, the expression of a particular trait in 3 generations, you will have to wait for around maybe 40 or 50, at least 50 years. So the generation time is another problem with the normal genetic crossing studies. That's why we go for pedigree. Then the third thing is definitely this one. The number of the offspring is also pretty low. In usually for a couple, for a family, only a limited number of offsprings will be there. Unlike in plants and other small other animals, the number of offsprings are also very small, so that you sometimes you cannot generalize, or you cannot end up with a concept or a theory because of the limited number of progenies, right? So these are the 3 most important limitation in human genetics and why we go for pedigree, right? So usually we'll depend on pedigree like analysis in humans and other species for which controlled matings are usually not possible, right? Then you can discuss what are the other study tools for study of inheritance. And before we go for the discussion of pedigree, these are the basic terms. These are basic terms we usually encounter during this discussion: genotype, phenotype, dominant allele, recessive allele, autosomal trait, sex-linked trait, homozygous. All those things are there. So in this part of presentation, I am not discussing much on these things. If you want to know more, you can go for you can refer back. Okay, there is one of my video in which you can find the reproduction pattern or the basis of inheritance and sex determination, in which all those things have been discussed. Okay, then what are the common symbols? As already said, there are some standard symbols and notations. So what are the common symbols and notations used in pedigree chart? These are the common symbols, you can note it down. For a square represents a male and circle represents a female. If it is in a diagonal shape, the sex of that individual is unknown, right? And if it is a filled one, if it's a blank one, vacant one, it's a unaffected individual. And if it's a filled one, if you draw it like filled, then it means that this particular individual is affected with that particular trait which is under study, right? Then you have all other things. If you have certain numbers in that, not in that symbols which represents the number, multiple numbers, then if you have a cross line, then which means that that individual has been dead due to affected by that trait. Then you have this one. When you have a cross line connecting a male and female, which represents a married couple. Actually, it's not a married couple, in fact, it's a sexually reproducing pair. A pair that they could do sexual reproduction. Right, and there is representation of generation 1 and generation 2, and there are these are the siblings. You can also see the siblings. Then another unusual relationship between individuals is that means that consanguineous mating. Usually this is the marriage or mating between closely related people. Usually the marriage of cousins and all those are represented by a double line between this individual, right? And you can also see the notation for adopted son, and also for monozygotic or identical twins or dizygotic twins, or which is the non-identical twins. So in all those ways, these individuals and relationships are represented in a pedigree chart. A proband, we use the term proband in order to represent the individual who was studied for the first time, or in that individual this particular trait was subjected for study, right? That means a disease is observed in a particular person, and the geneticist studies the family of this affected person and draws a pedigree. Right, so this person from whom the pedigree is initiated is called the proband. Okay, and this is the notation for that. So this is the way how a pedigree will look like. You can see the family 1 and family 2, and also you can see the generation 1, generation 2 and generation 3, and also you can see the family 3. Right, you can see there are 3 children in the family 1 and 3 in the family 2, and also in the 3 there are 3 children represented. And the female from all these are not, there is no disease and all those things are represented. The female from the generation from the family 1 is married by the male, the son from the family 2. You can see that relationship, and in that relation or in that family they have 3 children, and that represents the 3rd family. So this is the way how this family tree will be represented. And by this part of presentation we are going to end, and in the next part we will discuss the various applications of pedigree analysis. Thank you for watching.